Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader and today we're reviewing State Building, Governance and World Order in the 21st Century, written by Francis Fukuyama in 2004. Francis Fukuyama is the author of the famous article and book, The End of History, but he also has written some other political science and economics books. And this one is called State Building, and it focuses on how to have sustainable institutions in a weak state, failed state situation. This is a very short book. It's in big letters and it's only 160 pages or so. And of course this is written right after the start of the Iraq War and also a little after the invasion of Afghanistan. And he divides this book in three main sections. So in section 1, Francis Fukuyama talks about the scope and the strength of a state. So basically post-Cold War, the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, you had this emphasis on deregulating the state, making it as small as possible. And Francis Fukuyama says, while it is good to decrease the scope of the state, the scope that it still has, you need to strengthen that aspect. So things like the rule of law, the police force, the military, the courts, education, healthcare, those functions of government need to be strengthened, which means they need to be more effective, more efficient. So the situation Francis Fukuyama describes for many countries, failed states, weak states, is that you see they have a large scope, so they are very ambitious, so they promise this and that and this and that. But the strength of the state to carry out anything, even the most basic of services and the rule of law, is very narrow and limited. So that means that you cannot enforce property rights, you don't have a rule of law, you can't enforce contracts. Basically, without the rule of law, capitalism doesn't function. The thing with aid organizations is that they often make the problem worse. So when you have a bunch of doctors who come into a poor country and they're curing everyone of AIDS or they're vaccinating everyone, they're doing this without really helping build up the healthcare infrastructure in that country. Basically, Francis Fukuyama describes here that instead of going and helping people directly, we should instead be focusing on strengthening the institutions within the country that's gonna help people. And I kind of agree with that. Aid is often very, very problematic. Section 2 talks about the black box of public administration. And here basically Francis Fukuyama states that norms are more important than incentives. So that is why bureaucracy and corporations are a lot more efficient in East Asia, so in Japan for example, than in Latin America, so in Argentina for example. So that's why one policy that works very well in East Asia doesn't work that well in Latin America, and which is why Latin America is poorer, less developed than East Asia. Final section Francis Fukuyama talks about is international legitimacy. Francis Fukuyama starts out by saying basically that sovereignty is not supreme. That's something we've realized. So when the state is weak, you have a humanitarian crisis such as genocide or famine, then humanitarian would be justified. This is the opposite of the realist vision of international relations. And Francis Fukuyama also compares the American and European view in relation to international democratic legitimacy. And what does this mean? The American view is constitutionalism. So basically, the international system we have, international law, it's based on contracts, it's based on constitutions, it's based on the consent of the governed, on people, on the state, on democratic elections. Which basically means that if the US government decides, okay, we're not gonna abide by the Kyoto protocols, we're not gonna sign it, while they refuse to sign that contract, so then they're not bound by it. While the Europeans emphasize more internationalism than democracy, and they have some high-minded vision of internationalism, basically that yeah, power is naturally delegated from above and is more important than the democratic will of the people. One problem with Europe is that they think we live in a post-power politics era and that the end of history has arrived throughout the world. Yes, it is true that the end of history has arrived in the West in a sense, but outside of the West the end of history hasn't really arrived. What does this mean? This means that power and military intervention is still relevant. So whenever you have an international crisis, Europe basically says, we're gonna apply international law, so things like sanctions. But that's not always that effective. While the USA still understands that power is relevant and they're much more ready to use military intervention. So when you had crises in Bosnia and Kosovo, it was always the USA that acted most strongly. The only reason Europe ever acts on the international stage is because America twists her arm. That's the summary of the main ideas of Francis Fukuyama's book, State Building. So, how would I rate State Building by Francis Fukuyama? I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. So Francis Fukuyama discusses a lot of different ideas, provides a bunch of different perspectives, criticizes a bunch of different things. It's very interesting and it's very thought-provoking, but still some of the things that he says in this book, it's kind of weird. Like, he's very ambiguous on the war in Iraq in this book, for example. He talks about weapons of mass destruction, but that hasn't really been a real-world problem in practice. But his discussion of how norms are very important, that is true, but incentives are still relevant. And the discussion of scope versus strength of the state is interesting, but how wide he views the scope should be of the state, I disagree with. Fukuyama basically implies that healthcare and education should be handled by the state, which is too much for me. But I agree with Fukuyama on the cruciality of having a strong state in relation to the rule of law and enforcement of contracts and property rights. And that means having a police force and a bureaucracy that does its job instead of screwing around and being corrupt. But what's not mentioned in this book? A very simple solution to corruption. If you have corrupt bureaucrats, just raise their salaries. If you raise their salaries, they're gonna be more loyal to you and they're gonna be less tempted to get money from people. So would I recommend State Building by Francis Fukuyama? If you're interested in the subject of humanitarian intervention and trying to make institutions in failed states lasting, then yeah, I would recommend this book. It is flawed, but it is still a worthwhile read. And if you enjoyed this book review, then I would recommend you to check out my book review of Monsoon by Robert Kaplan, which also talks about some problems within some states, but emphasizes more the importance of decentralization. Anyways, I'm the avid reader, and I will see you readers next time.